I want to tell you the truth about what finally pushed me to make a change. No, it wasn't a vision board, and it wasn't a coaching breakthrough. It was fear. Specifically, the fear of who I was becoming. I could feel it in my body before I could name it in my mind. My digestion was a mess, and I was doing what any solution-oriented person would do, chasing remedies. Ginger tinctures, supplements, anything to fix what I assumed was a nervous stomach problem. And it took me longer than I'd like to admit to recognize that my body wasn't asking for a tincture. It was asking me to pay attention. That's when I realized something I hadn't understood before. The reinvention wasn't the risk, staying was. Hi there, I'm Wendy Rimmelsbacher, and welcome to the podcast show, Dim to Daring. Do you feel like there's something bigger waiting for you, but you're not sure how to make it happen? You're in the right place. I'm here to bring you inspiring stories, powerful insights, and practical strategies to help you reignite your spark, realign with your purpose, and take those bold steps towards the life you were meant to live. Let's dive in, because you're not finished yet. You're just getting started. Have you ever achieved something you worked years for and then felt strangely unimpressed once you got there? Not relieved, not excited, just quietly wondering why it doesn't feel the way you thought it would? If that sounds familiar, you might be experiencing what I call an identity hangover. Welcome back to Dim to Daring, the podcast for women who are done playing small and done pretending that a life that looks good on paper is the same thing as a life that feels right. Today's episode is one I've been sitting with for a while because it speaks to something I see constantly. This particular kind of disorientation that comes not from failure and not from loss, but from success. From building exactly what you set out to build and then quietly realizing it no longer fits who you've become. And before we go any further, if you're feeling this right now, you are in very good company. If you've been with this show for a while, you know a bit about my story. The girl who showed up with high personal expectations in every sport she played, who turned that same drive into bold career moves, earned her CPA license, and eventually found herself in the CFO seat at a public school district. Now, from the outside, it looked like everything was working. But slowly, that life started to dim, and I kept ignoring the cues until burnout moved in and made itself at home. That was my identity hangover, and it's exactly what we're unpacking today, because you deserve more than white-knuckling your way through a life that stopped fitting you. And later in this episode, I'm going to share the moment I realized my body had been trying to tell me something long before my mind was ready to hear it. A realization that completely changed the direction of my life. Let's start with the definition, because naming something is one of the most powerful things we can do with an experience that's been living in the shadows. An identity hangover happens when the life you're living no longer fits the person you've become. It's that slow, creeping recognition that you've outgrown a role you once worked incredibly hard to step into. Maybe even a role you prayed for, planned for, sacrificed for. And now you're standing inside it, wondering when it started to feel like someone else's dream. It shows up when you achieve something, and instead of fireworks, you feel strangely flat, numb, like your soul didn't get the memo that this was supposed to be the finish line with the celebratory party afterwards. It happens when you're successful by every external measure, but there's a restlessness underneath it all that you can't logic your way out of. When you've evolved as a person, but your environment and your role and your identity haven't kept pace. No one prepares you for the grief of outgrowing something you once desperately wanted. We get all the coaching and vision boards for chasing the dream, right? What we don't get is any preparation for what happens when the dream comes true and then stops feeling like your dream. In my last episode, I talked about identity dimming, that disorienting moment when a role ends and you're left asking who you are without it. Today I'm going one layer deeper because an identity hangover doesn't wait for the role to end. It shows up while you're still in it, still showing up, still performing the part, even as something inside you has quietly moved on. I worked with a client once, let's call her Jenna, who had done everything right. She followed her dreams, earned her degree, landed a coveted role at a well-respected corporation, and then kept going, adding credentials, building expertise, showing up as someone her team could genuinely rely on. Now, from the outside, her path looked like a straight line of wins. But inside, she was exhausted in a way that rest couldn't fix. For a long time, she had been quietly fighting herself, pushing down that voice that kept whispering she might be in the wrong place. And not because she lacked the ability, quite the opposite. Her drive, her focus, and her intensity to truly deliver, those were the things that made her exceptional. But in an environment where the pace was more relaxed, her energy was regularly misread. She'd walk into meetings ready to solve problems and move things forward. The rest of the room, well, they were content to keep talking about the weekend. Because she was so capable, the organization kept adding to her plate. Her compensation never quite caught up with the level she was actually operating at. She was pouring herself into an environment that simply couldn't meet her where she was. When we started working together, and she finally gave herself permission to be honest with herself, something shifted. She stopped trying to make herself fit and started getting curious about what might actually fit her. She eventually stepped away from her corporate path, giving herself space to explore, to listen to her instincts, and to ask a different question. What would my life look like if I stopped performing and started living? She doesn't have a tidy ending yet. She's still in the exploration phase. But here's what she told me recently. For the first time in years, she feels like herself again. And that is not a small thing. What Jenna was experiencing, that confusion, exhaustion, and that quiet questioning of a life that looks successful from the outside, isn't rare, especially among high-achieving women. In fact, there's a name for the complicated emotions that show up when the life you work so hard to build no longer feels like yours. I want to introduce you to a concept, and I want you to really give it some thought because we are not used to putting these two words together. Ready? Success grief. Yep, success grief. We talk about failure grief constantly. The job you didn't get, the relationship that ended, the business that didn't make it. That kind of grief, society knows what to do with. People bring you casseroles for that type of grief. They send cards. They know how to show up. But success grief? We don't have language for that yet, and we should. Because what I see when I work with women and what I have felt in my own life is that when you outgrow a version of yourself you worked hard to become, you don't just feel restless. You grieve. And it's layered, complicated, often silent kind of grief. You grieve the version of you that built all of this. The woman who was hungry and scrappy and laser focused, who sacrificed weekends and said no to things she wanted and kept going when it was hard. She got you there. She did her job beautifully. And she's not who you are today. There's a real tenderness in honoring her and letting her go. You grieve the dream itself. not just what you built, but the story you told about where you were headed and who you were becoming. When the dream no longer lights you up the way it used to, it's not just a role you're grieving, it's an identity. You grieve the time, how long you stayed, even after you knew. And somewhere inside, you did know that something had shifted. You grieve the energy you poured into something that no longer feels like yours. Success grief is lonely because the world looks at your life and sees something to celebrate while you're quietly in mourning. You can't take it to a support group. You can't post about it honestly without bracing for the, "But you have so much to be grateful for," comments. So you smile, you keep going, and the hangover just gets louder. When I was in my own messy middle, my life looked completely put together from the outside. I was still showing up, still dressed the part, and I want to tell you, I did that intentionally. Getting dressed in the morning, showing up as the professional I had worked so hard to become, was one of the few ways I could anchor myself. But underneath that exterior, I was working weekends, not sleeping well, and grieving quietly behind a face I had learned to wear very convincingly. You see, I told myself I was burned out from the acceleration of demands on my department. And that was partially true. But when I finally got honest with myself, I realized the real source of the exhaustion wasn't the workload. It was the weight of suppressing my own inner truth. I was overworked, yes. The demands were rapid, yes. But more than that, I felt unseen, underappreciated for what I was actually bringing. And I had been ignoring that feeling for so long that it had become indistinguishable from just who I was. Once I allowed myself to name it, to stop performing an illusion of contentment and start listening to what was actually going on, everything shifted. Leaving a career and an identity that had once genuinely lit me up wasn't easy. But on the other side of that decision was a version of me that felt healthier, more alive, and more like herself than I had in years. Now let's talk about that voice that shows up the moment you start to feel any of this. You know the one. The voice that arrives right when you're starting to get honest with yourself and immediately tries to shut the conversation down. It sounds like this: "I should be grateful for what I have. Other women would love to be in this position. This is a good life. Who am I to want something different? What right do I have to feel this way?" Here's what I want to say to that voice. It's not entirely wrong. Gratitude is real, and also perspective matters. But there's a difference between gratitude and using your gratitude as a weapon against your own growth. And if you spent years prioritizing everyone else, you may have learned to do exactly that. Gratitude and desire can coexist. You can appreciate everything you've built and still feel called towards something more aligned with who you are now. That's not ingratitude, and it's not greed. That's growth. That's moving into alignment with your soul. And I want to be clear about what I'm saying because this really matters. Staying inside a life that no longer fits you, not because you've chosen it consciously, but because you feel guilty for wanting something more, that's not gratitude. It's shrinking. And you didn't come this far to make yourself small. Okay, let's go back to Jenna for a moment because her story speaks directly to this. Jenna loved her work. She was skilled, she knew it, and she showed up every day giving her team and clients everything she had. But she was surrounded by colleagues who moved at a different pace. people who arrived at meetings to talk about the weekend rather than solve problems. And instead of honoring her own drive, she spent her energy trying to tone it down. That's right, trying to fit, trying not to be too much. When I asked her why she stayed, the answer was familiar. She felt guilty for wanting more for an environment that was, by most standards, perfectly fine. People had good intentions. Her projects were interesting, and it was a good job. Who was she to want something different? But here's what we uncovered when we dug into her core values and her non-negotiables. She wasn't being too much. She was simply in the wrong place for who she actually was. She had been shrinking her drive to match an environment that was never going to meet her, and called that shrinking gratitude. Once she saw it clearly, she couldn't unsee it. She stopped trying to make her excellence smaller and started giving herself permission to ask what was actually next for her. And the woman I'm talking to now, she's not dreading what's next. She is lit up by it. So we've named it. We've grieved it. We've let go of the guilt around it. Now comes the part that trips most people up. And I think it's the most important part of this conversation. Because recognizing that you've outgrown something is one thing. Actually deciding to do something about it is entirely different. And it comes with a very specific kind of fear that tends to show up quietly in the middle of the night, disguised as practical concerns. The panic sounds like, if I change, will I lose the people who knew the old me, the ones whose relationship with me is built around who I've always been? Or, if I pivot, will I look unstable, like I couldn't follow through? Or, if I admit I want something different, what does that say about my last 20 years? Or this one. What if I'm wrong? At least what I have now is known, and known is safe. Underneath all those voices is one core fear. That reinvention is a betrayal. That choosing to evolve means somehow erasing everything that came before, all the sacrifice, all the work, all the years you spent becoming who you are. But here's a different way to hold it. Reinvention isn't a betrayal of who you are. It's an honoring of who you've become. The woman who built that life, she did exactly what she was supposed to do. She got you here, to this moment of awareness, to this threshold, to this conversation with yourself. That doesn't disappear when you choose to grow. It becomes the foundation for everything that's next. I want to tell you the truth about what finally pushed me to make a change. No, it wasn't a vision board, and it wasn't a coaching breakthrough. It was fear. Specifically, the fear of who I was becoming. I could feel it in my body before I could name it in my mind. My digestion was a mess, and I was doing what any solution-oriented person would do, chasing remedies. Ginger tinctures, supplements, anything to fix what I assumed was a nervous stomach problem. And it took me longer than I'd like to admit to recognize that my body wasn't asking for a tincture. It was asking me to pay attention. The discomfort wasn't a digestive problem. It was a misalignment problem. That's right, years of staying the course in a life I had outgrown, and my body was trying to sound off warning alarms. What finally cracked it open for me was sitting with an uncomfortable question. If I stayed on this path, who was I going to become? Because I could see her taking shape, and she wasn't someone I recognized. She was tired, jaded, and moving further and further away from the values I had built my whole identity around, which were health, positivity, and growth. Once I stopped looking for ways to camouflage the unhappiness and started getting genuinely curious about what was next, something remarkable happened. The anxiety began to lift. The tension started to release. And when I finally gave myself full permission to pivot, not someday, but actually pivot, my whole body felt it, like it had been waiting for that decision longer than I had. That's when I realized something I hadn't understood before. The reinvention wasn't the risk, staying was. Before we get to the framework, before we get practical and tactical, I want to give you something to just sit with for a moment. Not to answer, not to fix, not to turn into a to-do list, just to feel. Who are you becoming? Not who you've been, but who are you actively becoming right now? What used to feel expansive that now feels tight? What role are you still performing that no longer feels like an authentic expression of who you are? And where are you making yourself smaller to maintain something that may have already run its course? Those questions don't need answers today, but they do need space, and you may not have been giving them any. Awareness is step one, but we don't actually live in awareness. We live in action. So let's talk about what that looks like. Here's a simple exercise I use in my coaching work. I call it the 3-part identity audit. 3 columns, that's it. You can do it on a piece of paper, in a journal, in a notes app, wherever you actually think you're best. The format doesn't matter, but your honesty certainly does. And if this episode is hitting close to home, you might even create some space later today. Hit the pause button right now and try this during that time that you have scheduled. Step 1. In the first column, write down your role, title, and your reputation. Everything that has defined your identity and how the world has known you. Don't edit it, and there's no judging and no explaining. Just the honest inventory of the life and identity you've created. And then title this column, What I Built. Step 2. In the second column, get real about where the energy is draining, where your values feel misaligned, what bores you now that used to light you up, and where you are going through the motions. Where does it feel like you're performing a version of yourself that's a few years out of date? And give yourself permission to write it, even if it's uncomfortable. And then title that second column, What I've Outgrown. Step 3. The third column is where it starts to open up. What are you quietly curious about? Not what you think you should want, but what actually tugs at you. Who do you look at with that little pang of envy that, if you're honest, is really pointing at something you want for yourself? What keeps coming back, no matter how many times you set it aside? Write it all down. Title the third column, What I'm Becoming. Now, the distance between column 2 and column 3, that's your direction. The goal here isn't to blow up your life tomorrow. It's to start paying attention to the direction your curiosity is pointing and to begin taking small steps that let that future version of you get a little more oxygen. You don't need a 5-year plan. You don't need to have it all figured out before you take a step. You just need a willingness to look honestly at what's there and to trust that curiosity is one of the most reliable compasses you have. Let me leave you with this, and I want you to really listen. An identity hangover isn't a crisis. It isn't evidence that you made wrong choices or that you don't appreciate what you have or that something is broken in you. It is, in fact, evidence of the opposite. It means you are someone who kept growing even after you succeeded, who didn't let achievement be the ceiling, who refused to stop becoming. That is something to be genuinely proud of. You are not ungrateful. You are not broken. You are not going backwards. You're expanding, and that's exactly where the next chapter begins. I want to leave you with something personal. When I was sitting in that CFO office, working weekends, chasing ginger tinctures, and wearing the professional face over the grieving one, I could not have imagined that the other side of the chapter looked like this. Like a podcast called Dim to Daring. Like standing on stages, speaking to rooms full of driven women who recognize that quiet moment when success stops feeling like alignment. Like coaching women who are ready to stop shrinking and step into who they were actually meant to be. Like conversations with you, someone who may be living the exact story I once couldn't name. Like work that doesn't just light me up. It feels like the truest expression of who I actually am. The hangover ended, and a new chapter began. And I am living proof that what feels like losing yourself is often the beginning of finally finding her. Keep believing in yourself and keep daring to evolve. Thank you so much for joining me today on Dim to Daring. If this episode resonated with you, I'd love it if you subscribed, shared it with a friend, or left a review. It helps more women just like you discover the show. Remember, you're not finished yet, you're just getting started. Until next time, keep daring to grow and shine.